So you should put a glove on his head.
Good evening. My name is Molly Anderson, and as Executive Director at the Athenaeum, I'd like to welcome you to the final program of this year's Geschke lecture. Can you hear me? I want to make sure that this is closer. Sorry. I'd like to remind you all to turn off your cell phones or mobile devices. The Geschke lecture series is made possible by several grants, one from the Geschke Foundation and one from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And the proceeds from this series make it possible for the Athenaeum to do more than 1,000 programs free all year long for the whole community and all ages. So I'd like to take a moment to thank the Geschkes and to thank all of you who support your public library. Dr. Shreffler grew up, I found out at dinner, upstate New York. But then he went far west to college. He says not to get away from his parents, but I think maybe. He did get his medical degree and a PhD from New York University, and his pediatrics training was at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He completed his fellowship in allergy and immunology at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. He's currently at Mass General Hospital as Chief of Pediatric Allergy and Immunology, and as Director of Food Allergy Center, and Principal Investigator of the Center for Immunology and Inflammatory Diseases. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shreffler.
Thank you, Molly. I'm going to try without the mic. If I don't project well, please tell me, because I probably want to move around a little bit. But first, let me start by thanking Molly, thanking the directors of the Athenaeum, thanking Susan Fitzpatrick for sort of suggesting me. It's been a delight to be here for a little while. It's an incredible honor to present in this distinguished lecture series. And I must admit, I always find it challenging to address a public audience. I do get sort of all up in sort of the immunology of this problem, but I'm also very passionate about the clinical problem, and I split my time both between clinical practice as a pediatric allergist. I have 2 clinics per week, which is really completely filled with pediatric food allergy, as well as run a small lab where I'm focused on sort of the immune mechanisms of tolerance in the context of food allergy. And so what I want to try to do is speak to what I often find are sort of 2 halves of an audience in a forum like this. Those who have personal experience and have been impacted either usually by a child or a grandchild, sometimes personally, with immediate hypersensitivities or food allergies, as they're kind of probably best known. These can cause anaphylaxis and severe reactions. And then another sizable subset of the audience, and these are not mutually exclusive, that also just kind of wonder what the heck is going on here? Why does it seem like, you know, every person I know is on some avoidance diet, and how do I parse this out and make sense of it? So in my latest, hopefully not too clumsy effort to sort of address both sides of this, I'm going to kind of go through relatively quickly this sort of set of slides and try to reserve a substantial chunk of our time together for a Q&A. So I hope that will meet the need. By way of background, Molly mentioned some of my history. I am often asked, you know, how did I end up in food allergy? I actually started studying the immune system from the perspective of parasitology. And it turns out that the immune defense that we mount to protect us from ectoparasites, so everything from ticks and lice perhaps, and parasitic worms, as well as the immune defense against noxious and toxic stimuli, shares many similarities and in many regards has the same sort of fundamental characteristic of that leads to allergies. And in my pediatric training in New York, I encountered a remarkable burden of allergic disease in the form of pediatric asthma. And I heard about this guy at Mount Sinai who was sort of starting to study the basics of food allergy and really define it, and what are the major allergens and who does it affect and what are the risks. His name was Hugh Sampson. He became my mentor for my postdoctoral training and early fellowship time. I joined Mount Sinai in faculty for a few years, but then I had the good fortune to be recruited to Mass General and really had the opportunity to lead this multidisciplinary group at the Food Allergy Center and benefit from many collaborations around the city as well as nationally. So many of the things that I'm going to attempt to spout off on as an expert, many of the questions that are often probably closest to your sort of the forefront of your mind are things that touch on epidemiology and things like that, whereas my research focus personally is on cellular immunology. So I'll be candid about telling you what I don't know as well, but I hope we'll have many challenging questions and we can explore it together. Certainly, I follow the field very closely because of my practice. So let me see if I can make this work. So I think that, again, for many of you, hopefully this doesn't feel like remedial allergy 101 that you're sort of well versed in because you deal with it personally. But for a lot of you, I suspect that there's confusion about even fundamentally what we define as a food allergy versus an intolerance. And my title was asked to sort of span both of these things. So it's important, I think, to remember, and this is a very practical benefit, and if I have, for example, a resident who's rotating through allergy in my clinic, where it's all about adverse reactions to foods. Is this a pointer? Oh, it's very dim. I'll go through this sort of algorithm of thinking about what are the various ways in which foods can make us sick. And some of them have nothing to do at all with allergy. So, food, not surprisingly, has many bioactive chemicals in it, or it can be subject to spoilage. And the bacteria or other things that might spoil our food will elaborate or create chemicals that can cause adverse symptoms to food. So here, for example, caffeine will trigger migraines for many people, right? That's an adverse reaction to a food. It has nothing to do with the immune system so far as we know. It's not a food allergy. Some people get flushing from alcohol. They have a relative deficiency in alcohol dehydrogenase, and they turn very red very quickly after just one drink. It has nothing to do with an allergic reaction. Then there's a whole set of non-toxic or metabolic adverse reactions to foods. These can include things like panic attacks, often actually and interestingly a comorbidity of true IgE-mediated immediate type food allergies. There can be intolerances. A good example of this would be, for example, lactose intolerance, where you lack the ability to sufficiently digest the sugar in milk, and you get bacterial overgrowth, and because of fermentation you get bloated and you don't feel well. That has, again, not an immune-mediated adverse response to a food. Or you can indeed have immunological adverse reactions to foods. And here's where the allergic response is a subset, and that can include the sort of predominant IgE mediated subset. This stands for immunoglobulin E. This is the least abundant class of antibody that your immune system makes, but it's what is responsible for immediate type reactions, whether it's to birch pollen that you inhale in the spring or to a peanut allergen that you ingest if you're a sensitized person. And it's the production of this IgE that is necessary, though not sufficient, for having true immediate type food allergies. But there are also true non-IgE forms of food allergies. Some people may have heard of a disease, we'll see if there's a show of hands here, it doesn't have to be you, that have something called eosinophilic esophagitis, for example, or food protein-induced enterocolitis syndrome. No? No? Okay. So these are, in the case of EOE for sure, eosinophilic esophagitis, chronic inflammatory, immune-mediated responses, often to dietary proteins. Much like someone who has eczema has a chronic inflammatory immune response, often triggered by allergen, but it can also be more complex, and other antigens can start to drive that pathology as well. And even something like celiac disease, in the broadest sort of way of thinking about this definition of immune-mediated adverse reactions to foods, would fall into this, because even though ultimately the inflammation may be more promiscuous than to just the initial inciting wheat-derived trigger, nevertheless it is triggered by that, and the disease goes away if you effectively avoid gluten. There's also, and here's where I want to, before kind of getting into food intolerances and some of the confusion out there, and frankly, I think some of the misinformation out there, I want to acknowledge right up front this area with some question marks of possible overlap between what we kind of call intolerance. I gave you the easy example of intolerance in the case of lactose intolerance, an intolerance that we understand the mechanism for. But there are many things, ways that food make people feel crummy, that we end up calling intolerances where we don't really understand the mechanism very for, and indeed in some cases we're not even sure how real it is, real in sort of quotes, not in a disparaging sense. And so I think we have to acknowledge that there may be things in here that are yet to be discovered, and I want to come back to that and actually plug the importance of basic research to help us get there. So this is what I'm going to sort of spend most of the time talking about. It's this group of immune-mediated responses to foods that leads to people being sick, that's characterized by this parasite-related form of the immune response that I mentioned, whose signature immune response and molecule is IgE, but can also include non-IgE forms that also have a similar characteristic in terms of the immune response. So to the, anyone with sort of an immunology background, obviously I'm talking about a Th2 kind of response. So this form of food allergy is now thought to affect about 5% of the US population. That's a huge number. We're talking about millions of people, and the prevalence of this is now similar in many countries, Australia, much of Europe, including the UK, and other parts of the world are seeing an increase in prevalence, especially in the developing world. As I said already, there are both IgE and non-IgE mediated forms, one example being eosinophilic esophagitis. This is a problem that is associated with a significant quality of life burden. It has a huge impact on the people that are affected. The prevalence has grown. I'll show a little bit of information about that. And the inciting allergens, the proteins predominantly as we understand it, that drive this immune response are captured by a relatively few list of food sources. So while people can be allergic to almost any food, these few foods, egg, wheat, peanut, shellfish, fish, legumes including peanuts, tree nuts, and milk, represent more than 80% of all of the food allergies that we diagnose. Peanut allergy alone affects about 1% of the US population. Accidental reactions are common. They occur for people that are diagnosed on average every 1 to 2 years, resulting in hundreds of thousands of ED visits annually. And there are very limited treatment options. Essentially, all that's approved right now is avoidance and carrying an epinephrine auto-injector. Oral immunotherapy is a new form of intervention that's currently under clinical investigation. It's now the subject of 2 trials that are in progress, or I apologize. Oral immunotherapy is specifically the subject of 1 phase 3 trial. There's another form of immunotherapy that's in phase 3 trials as well. And it consists of essentially just escalating doses of peanut flour. Now, while the burden on quality of life is enormous and there are many reactions resulting in emergent visits, the good news is that deaths, not to put too fine a point upon it, are fortunately extremely rare, although obviously incredibly tragic, because ultimately this is avoidable. As I said, most of the common allergens account for disproportionately the problem. Also, there's a disproportionate representation of some allergens with severity. So peanuts, for example, account for many more emergency room visits and severe reactions, as do tree nuts, than other allergens. To some extent, the same allergens that people tend to outgrow earlier in life, such as milk and egg and wheat, are to some extent also associated with less severe reactions. Again, however, there are many exceptions. And some people, especially those who have persistent milk allergy, the point made here, also have more severe milk allergy. So there's a correlation or relationship between the severity of the allergy that one has and its persistence throughout life. There's also a relationship between which allergens tend to do that. So why are they, or even fundamentally, are they more common? This is probably the question that I'm asked more than any other single question is, are we really seeing an increase in the prevalence of food allergy, or are we just diagnosing it more often? And it's a surprisingly difficult question, another one that's in need, in fact, of more research, because one of the problems we have is that the test that we rely on to make the diagnosis most often, which is a test for allergen-specific IgE, that class of antibody that is necessary, though not sufficient for disease, is very nonspecific. So there will be many people who have detectable IgE to a food that are nevertheless able to eat it with impunity. They don't actually have clinical allergy when they consume it. And so large systematic studies, population studies to address questions of prevalence are hindered by this fact. If you look for the presence of IgE, you find it in many more people that actually have the disease. So how can we know what the true prevalence of the disease is? So increasingly, more and more studies rely on what's called an oral food challenge. So it sounds maybe fancier than it is. It's essentially nothing more than systematically feeding someone the food that's suspected to be a trigger in a medical setting so that they're safe if they have a reaction to make the diagnosis. And believe it or not, in 2016, that remains the gold standard for diagnosis. So with a combination of studies looking at oral food challenges and studies, in some cases, large population studies that have looked at IgE, investigators over the last few years have been able to make better estimates of prevalence. And it does seem like the best data are all pointing in the same direction, that consistent with a rise in other forms of allergic disease over the last several decades, including asthma and eczema, food allergy has increased. And even more interestingly, some forms of allergic disease, such as eczema and food allergy, appear to be still increasing, and increasing at a higher rate than hay fever and asthma, which appear to have leveled off in the population. So the large trend over time is that over decades, all allergic disease has gone up, very much in lockstep with other non-communicable diseases, such as obesity and metabolic related, so diabetes, et cetera. But then food allergy has increased more persistently and more rapidly in the last few years. And here's a little bit of data to back that up. So this is showing from the CDC the estimate that they made of food allergy. This is a little bit dependent upon self-report and comes out with a relatively high number of around 9%. Most estimates put it between 5 and 8, but the trend of increase, nevertheless, is reproducible across many studies. Furthermore, there has been this observation, which I alluded to a little bit regarding non-communicable diseases, of the inverse relationship between infectious disease burden and chronic disease burden. And allergy fits into this overall trend. Where in development you see declines in rates of communicable diseases, you see increases in the rise of chronic diseases, including allergy. So, why? So these parents obviously are reading the latest research and understand the connection between a healthy microbiome and your risk for autoimmune and other immune-related disease. And they might be getting a little bit ahead of the research. I'm not sure they really needed to get the kid's tongue involved here. Nevertheless, one of the leading hypotheses about why we see this inverse relationship and why allergic diseases have been increasing over the last few years has to do with how we've fundamentally changed the way our immune systems develop. So our genetics have not changed in 40 years. What has changed, though, is the way we grow up in pretty fundamental ways, from everything including the pervasiveness of the use of antibiotics in ourselves and in our agriculture, as well as other food industry practices are potentially on the table as potentially related. All of these things have an impact on how the gut microbiome, the billions of bacteria that literally outnumber your own cells by a factor of 10, develop, and how they impact the immune system during early years that are critical for its development, and especially for developing an appropriate regulatory, an immune dampening kind of feedback loop. So that's all I'm going to say about that. That's about the level of my understanding. So where does that bring us in terms of current management? Well, as I alluded to before, unfortunately, current management really consists of education on how to effectively implement an avoidance diet and how to treat yourself in a situation of an accidental ingestion, which, as I mentioned before, just in one study looking at peanut allergy, occurred on average every 1 to 2 years. This is an example of an action plan like I give out in clinic, where there's a list of signs and symptoms that indicate the need for immediate use of an autoinjector versus those that are more mild and might be effectively treated with some observation or the use of an antihistamine. And these are plans that for patients that are affected, they have copies at the school or other caregivers, and it's part of their daily life and routine to effectively manage this. The impact, as you can imagine, is quite significant. So in, again, this is not the kind of research that I do personally, but in systematic surveys of quality of life using validated instruments of the type that are used by experts in this kind of field, comparing people with food allergy to a variety of other chronic diseases, the impact is quite comparable. And perhaps not surprisingly, because food is so intensely social. So it has obviously innumerable impacts on planning of social activities, things like schools and camps, vacations, every time one goes to a restaurant, and finding appropriate childcare. So when I am invited, for example, to speak to someone in the food industry, I will often make the point that it's going to be that one person in the party of 8 that's going to drive the decision over dinner if they have a food allergy. And it's that kind of spreading effect, the impact on the school at a time where 1 to 2 kids in every classroom has one of these allergies that's potentially dangerous. It obviously becomes a public health issue. And educating around how to get that sort of message right is a real challenge for our field, and one that I fear we often haven't really met adequately. There are some things beyond just avoidance that we're trying to be better at. So I like to call this active management of food allergy. This is a lot of what I do in clinic. So understanding that earlier introduction may be of benefit, understanding what allergens are cross-reactive or more often coincident than others, so that I can advise effectively that child who presents with a walnut allergy which other allergens they're likely to have an issue with and test appropriately. But most importantly, I would say to not overly restrict the diet, especially early in life when kids really need developmentally to hit important milestones in their acceptance of new tastes and flavors and textures. So not overdiagnosing and yet anticipating which things are the problem, trying to get foods, in fact, into the diet earlier whenever possible, et cetera. And then increasingly the practice of sort of a mild form of desensitization. So 2/3 of kids, for example, who are milk or egg allergic can tolerate those food proteins if they're present in a baked product. And so introducing that because of its associated, there's data now showing that that helps to promote immune tolerance and outgrow the allergy altogether. Oral immunotherapy, as I mentioned, with and without combination of probiotics is something of interest. And then active risk management, as I like to call it. So allergen immunotherapy, if you just sort of do a Google search for this, you'll find lots of examples these days of it hitting upon foods. It's a term, immunotherapy, that's used broadly in multiple fields. There's a lot of excitement right now, for example, in what's going on to use immune-based therapies or immunotherapy in the context of fighting cancer, an area that I think is incredibly exciting and promising. And there, the problem is really exactly the opposite. In that case, you're trying to help the immune system break tolerance to recognize the cancerous cells of your own body. In the case of allergen immunotherapy, we're trying to establish or reestablish tolerance to a harmless dietary protein. Oral immunotherapy, while it's exciting that this is now something that's in phase 3 trial and may be someday, not too far from now, available for patients in clinical practice, does not come without its own problems. So in this meta-analysis, for example, of peanut allergy, the conclusions are largely what we see in studies that have followed, which are that what allergists call desensitization is achievable in most participants. Desensitization means that so long as you're actively exposed to the allergen, you can tolerate significant amounts without immediate or severe symptoms. However, it comes at a serious burden of frequent adverse events that are occasionally serious, requiring the use of an epinephrine autoinjector, and that durable tolerance appears to be the exception, not the rule, so much so that the indication that the company Aimmune is going for in their phase 3 trial for oral immunotherapy for people with peanut allergy will be as a chronic therapy given indefinitely for the prevention and abatement of accidental reaction and reaction severity. So it'd be something that kids would take every day to reduce the likelihood and severity of reactions associated from accidental ingestion. Now, how many of you are prescribed some sort of medication you have to take every day? Yeah. How many of you remember to take it every day? This is a pretty high-powered audience, so probably better than the average. But it's no easy thing for many people, let alone when you consider that you can't stand the taste of it, that a third of the time it gives you a bellyache, and once in a while you have to use your EpiPen. So this is not to sort of just totally throw cold water on this important, I think, milestone, but we already know that I would argue that we need to do better than this, and it's not a therapy that comes without a significant burden. And one of the big concerns we have regarding this last point is that children that start OIT, when they're under the direct supervision and influence of their parents, whether they'll continue to do it as they achieve independence, even before they go to college, but certainly once they do. All right. So this brings me to what I would argue is one of the things that we're most lacking in terms of management today, which is any sort of real meaningful assessment of risk, right? These are the questions I hear most often from my patients. How allergic am I or is my child? How dangerous is this? What are the dangers? What do I really have to worry about in the real world? And what's appropriate from a public health perspective? What should I be fighting over at the school or not? Where is the appropriate line to draw in terms of how I advocate effectively for my child, for example? So how do we address this? One of the things I think has to be an area that we're not always very comfortable going toward, which is how to contextualize the risk. So I mentioned before the fortunate fact that deaths due to food allergy are not common, and that's really because we've done a good job, and not good enough, but getting better, at getting education out, getting epinephrine autoinjectors out, which are effective in the treatment of anaphylactic reactions. They are, in fact, comparable to things like death due to automobile accidents in the US, and this is for people that are affected. And that's a message that I think we don't always very effectively convey in terms of how we help patients or how we discuss the management of a problem like this and how to balance it with other things. So what does the future look like? I've already talked about immunotherapy now. What I really hope is that we'll move from an era of Jenner giving attenuated smallpox and dealing with the consequent adverse events along with the benefit that brought to the use of things like adjuvants that will rationally push the immune system in a direction with fewer of the adverse events toward tolerance and more effective therapy. So what I think is really needed in order to get us toward this sort of thing is a much deeper understanding of what the healthy immune system response to dietary antigens really looks like. What does it mean that many patients, for example, make IgG antibodies to foods, a fact that is sometimes exploited in tests that look for IgG that I would argue we really don't understand whether those correlate to disease yet, or if at all. What does it mean when some patients that have a diagnosis of something like Crohn's disease completely resolve when they avoid major allergens in their diet? Is it possible that there are a subset of individuals who have what we would currently label an intolerance that is in fact immune mediated, and we just don't have the wit to perceive it or diagnose it? It's some of these very fundamental questions of the immune response to the diet, starting really from the innate immune system, those cells in the GI tract that are sensing not just the proteins that become the target of an IgE response, but the numerous active molecules in our diet and the bioactive molecules that are elaborated by the microbiome in response to what we eat. These are fundamental questions that we really have barely begun to address. So I'm going to pull it back to here for the overview, and I'd like to start really with questions at this point. Yeah.
What about genetics?
Yeah. So.
As far as food allergy?
Yeah, the question was, what about genetics with food allergy? So I alluded to the fact that population-based studies have been really hindered by the fact that we often only have in those kinds of studies a self-report and a measurement at best of IgE. Self-report we know is really flawed because self-report will often be on the order of 30%, 20% in some surveys, because that sort of mix of adverse reactions to foods is so broad. So that makes it very difficult to then do the genetics. If you don't know your phenotype, it's very difficult to accurately assign a genotype to it, unless you have massive numbers. So the bioinformaticists will tell me, you can overcome this with numbers. If you have millions, even if there's a substantial amount of noise in there, you can still get down to the genetics. That's one problem. There has been one well-conducted GWAS, so a genome-wide association study in food allergy. It was published in Nature Communications just a couple of years ago. What they found was a linkage to a cluster of genes called the HLA that are very important for the immune system. And that's kind of where things stand. There's that fundamental limitation right now of having large populations that are well enough defined with food challenges, the gold standard for diagnosis, to really do those. There's also, as I mentioned, right, the fact that there are clearly environmental factors as well. In fact, in allergy, where you have, if you start combining hay fever, asthma, food allergy, and you take the view that food allergy is perhaps a somewhat stochastic kind of, or a random, overlay of just having an allergic immune response. So you start talking about a phenotype of allergy broadly that's affecting 30%, 40% of the population. It's so penetrant that one wonders, if there are really very strong genetic factors at all. That said, allergies do clearly tend to run in families. There are also more numerous GWAS studies looking at other allergic disease, such as asthma, that have revealed stronger associations, for example, to IgE itself, to some of the cytokines, the sort of immune hormones that push toward IgE, and other things that I think are likely to be relevant when we think about food allergy as well. All right, how about here?
Are there any efforts to change somebody's DNA when there is a history of severe allergies as well as autoimmune problems?
So the question was, are there any efforts toward gene therapy or actually editing someone's DNA if there's a history of allergy? And presumably we'd be talking about very severe allergy indeed. Yeah. No, not that I know of. And part of the problem sort of harkens back to the last question is I don't think, well, that's maybe not fair. We don't know what the genetic risk factors are. That's not to say that, you could imagine, for example, a targeted DNA therapy at IgE. There is a DNA vaccine that is set to enter phase 1 clinical trials that expresses key peanut proteins in our own dendritic cells, the cells that are responsible for educating and presenting to our T cells, that I think is an example of that kind of more promising immunotherapy strategy that I mentioned at the end. But there's no effort that I know of to edit one's own genes in this context. Pardon me?
The T cells are in the autoimmune.
T cells are key players in autoimmune disease as well, that's right. Yeah.
I disagree with the sessions that are going on with introducing young children to peanuts.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up on peanut sandwiches, and
No jelly, just peanut? Peanut butter, I hope, surely. You didn't crunch up peanuts into, okay.
I mean, I'm so allergic that even if I am on an airplane and they serve peanuts, the molecules are so heavy in the plane that I have to always take Benadryl and my EpiPen with me. But I became allergic as an adult, as a young adult, even though I grew up on strawberry jam, peanut butter, avocado, all these things, bramble bush berries, all these things that
Yep.
go into anaphylactic attack if it's even presented somewhat with some of the other allergies. So.
Well, let me, if I may, so the comment in question was really along the lines of, if I could paraphrase it, what's the evidence that introducing peanut early on is helpful? So I didn't really go into this, but I mentioned that the epidemiology of food allergy was such that it's continued to increase, and perhaps with a steeper slope than other forms of allergic disease, just in the last decade. And one of the hypotheses about why that is has to do with recommendations that came out actually about the time that I was in residency and fellowship training to avoid quote-unquote high-risk foods in infancy and early childhood. And so I trained as a fellow telling all of my patients no peanut or tree nut until 3, no shellfish till 3, no egg till 18 months or 24 months. And in high-risk infants, considered delaying the introduction of milk and other things as well. So by the early mid-2000s, that was already beginning to come under assault by some really smart epidemiologists, most of them in Scandinavia, that have access to wonderful public health records and a lot of really detailed health information in large populations. And they started observing that there was an inverse relationship between the early introduction of fish to the diet and milk in another study and the onset of allergy. This was replicated in a study that came out of Israel as well. And then finally, a guy named George Dutoit in London made the working with Gideon Lack, made the observation that kids in Israel have very low rates of peanut allergy despite very comparable rates of food allergy to other things, including milk and egg and wheat, and also sesame, which is more common in the Mediterranean diet and was a real problem in terms of food allergy in that population. And he noticed that, or he was tipped off to the fact that an early teething food there is something called bomba, which is basically like a puff, like a cheese puff. What are those things called? Like Jacks or, those?
Cheetos.
Yeah, like Cheetos, but they're peanut flour based. And so that observation was published and ultimately led to a randomized controlled clinical trial, which is what we regard as our highest level of clinical evidence, that was 5 years in the running, initially screened 800 some kids, enrolled about 650. Essentially and these were very high risk infants. So they either had moderate to severe eczema or they had another food allergy diagnosed. And what they found was that those children randomized to the weekly consumption of peanuts, 6 grams at least per week, had an 80% risk reduction in peanut allergy diagnosed at 5 years. I think it's one study, it must be said, but it was a very well done study pointing in the same direction as some of the epidemiological data. I find it to be very persuasive, and more importantly than me, it's now basically rewriting the consensus guidelines. Now, that same group attempted to replicate that study, this time in a broader population and with more food antigens, and they actually failed to find any benefit. So there was no risk, but outside of that high-risk population, it didn't really seem to matter whether or not you introduced those foods early or not. And now your experience of adult-onset allergy to nut is not so atypical. So among the foods that people do become allergic to as adults, it's most often nuts and shellfish. And I do think that there's something about those foods that is fundamentally and intrinsically more allergenic than other foods. But I should get someone else's question.
Are you aware of any studies done by the peanut industry to identify sources of modification of the peanut, genetic modification of the protein itself, or the use of various sprays to hold down the weeds in peanut fields? It seems to me, having been around for a long time, and now having 2 grandchildren who are highly allergic to peanuts, and having been a pediatrician in the Air Force for a number of years and taking care of thousands of children where I never saw a peanut allergy 50 years ago, it seems to me that it's more likely that the peanut has changed than that children have changed.
That's a great provocative comment. So, well, I would submit that a lot has changed, not just the peanut, right? I mean, I think we've seen in the 50-year time span an increase of all sorts of allergic disease, not just peanut allergy. And so you could take the view, I mean, there were people that had peanut allergy around. Occasionally, I meet a grandparent who, has peanut allergy and had it since a kid. It's just much, much, much more rare. And so you could take the view, well, there have been some fundamental shifts in the way our immune systems are educated. We see a rise of allergic disease across the board, and this sort of, tail end of the spectrum, this more severe variant of allergies in general, has therefore also increased. It's kind of come along on the coattails. On the other hand, I am actually sympathetic to the view that there have been some important changes in the food industry. The proteins that our immune system recognizes, the stable seed storage proteins that are the major allergens that are disproportionately responsible for severe reactions. So in peanut, there's one called ARA-H2. This is a plant defense gene. So this is a protein that's involved in the plant's own immune system, defending it from fungal infection. And plants that are more stressed express higher levels of these allergens. And there's also differences in the maturity of the seed and how quickly they grow. So it could be that there have been either unintentional impacts of the way we've cultivated plants or the way that we grow them that might account for higher levels of allergens in our food. I do think that that's plausible. I'd also think that my former mentor, Hugh Sampson, was obsessed over this, and he doesn't have any data to back it up, but I think it's a cool idea anyway, which was that that peanut butter is the culprit. And so one of the things that has been observed is that, and this is true for milk homogenization and other ways in which our food is processed, that there is a tendency to essentially effectively mix the proteins with the fats and impact the way the proteins are absorbed from the GI tract, potentially in ways that makes them more immunogenic. So as you know, but maybe the whole audience doesn't know, the fat content of your meal goes through the lymphatic system, and that's where the immune players are. And so if you effectively in food processing combine the proteins with the fat, you might be delivering more protein content. And there are, I accused you of having no data to support it, there are animal model data to support that idea. Someone in the back here? Yeah.
You spoke earlier about children more likely outgrowing milk and eggs,
Yeah.
allergy rather than treatments. Can you speak a little bit more about that and why that's so?
So the question is, what's different about, or what can I just elaborate on the difference between milk and egg versus nuts in terms of the natural history of the disease diagnosed in kids? And so the data are that about 80% of children diagnosed in the first 2 years of life with milk or egg allergy will outgrow that allergy by the time, now we usually say by the time they're 10. We used to say by the time they go into kindergarten, by the time they're 5. So there are some data, especially from Hopkins, showing that, that it appears that as though the rate that people upon diagnosis are outgrowing may be longer than it used to be, or that's not a rate, but you know what I mean. As opposed to nuts, where only 20% of kids diagnosed early in life outgrow that at some point.
Peanuts are different than nuts.
That's true for peanuts and tree nuts. Yeah, and peanuts, although they're legumes, they really stand out. So certainly people, are often, well, not often, but in the allergist office, I see it a lot, allergic to other legumes. Soy is considered on many lists to be a major allergen. I think it's much lower than some of the data suggest and not as severe, but green pea, chickpea, those can certainly be potent allergens. Your point is well taken. Peanuts are not related to tree nuts, but interestingly enough, the natural history of the allergy to those things is very similar. And the major allergens, so I mentioned AirH2 in the context of peanut, that's the homologue to JUGR1 in walnut. So literally down to the molecular specificity of the proteins from these various foods that our immune system recognizes, it's not random. So it's the same protein families. Actually, this is true not only for food allergens, but across sort of the protein space that we're exposed to. There's a very small proportion of protein structures that are recognized as allergens by our immune system. And I'm sure that's no accident. These are proteins that are capable of stimulating the innate immune system. So that's the answer. 80% versus 20% for milk and egg versus outgrowing peanut or tree nut. Hand in front.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between food allergies and food intolerances?
Yeah.
Do you think the rise of food intolerances and its testing is becoming more of a trend versus a real concern?
So the question is on the difference between food allergies and intolerances, and whether maybe there's some faddishness to, or what I make of the testing in this area. It's a difficult question, and I certainly hope not to offend anyone in the group in trying to answer it, and really, truly, with all humility about that sort of intersection in those circles I showed with the question marks, because I really have little doubt that we will discover new aspects of pathological immune responses to food proteins that we don't understand now. That said, however, I do worry that there is, well, I know there's very good data that there's an overdiagnosis starting with IgE-mediated food allergies. And this isn't our patient's fault, this is entirely our fault, right? So, as I mentioned a couple times, the presence of IgE is necessary but not sufficient for having immediate food allergies. And many people, especially if they're already atopic, they have allergies in general, they will make IgE generally at lower levels than in people who are truly allergic, but certainly detectable. They'll have positive skin tests, et cetera, to many things that they're not allergic to. And even more confusingly, sometimes they are allergic under the right circumstances, like if they consume alcohol or exercise vigorously after consumption of wheat, and they might never otherwise react, but under the right circumstances they may. So even in the IgE realm, we commit the sin of overdiagnosis. One of the things that's out there and that I confront a lot in clinical practice is patients who have had other forms of food allergy testing. both clinical practice of provocation type testing where people are measuring weakness, et cetera, to make a diagnosis, or the measurement of IgG antibodies, which is another class of antibody that's there, really to fight viruses and bacterial infections. And those have, in my opinion, never been reproducibly shown to diagnose a clearly defined set of symptoms or clinical problem. And I fear that, and this is not just my view, but this is the straight-laced allopathic view. This is what the American Academy of Asthma, Allergy, and Immunology will say, et cetera. So there are conditions where IgG is elevated, and they're thought-provoking. So if you have celiac disease or if you have inflammatory bowel disease, you'll make higher levels of IgE, probably because there's a barrier breach in your GI tract and your immune system is seeing higher levels of those allergens. But to a first order of approximation at least, basically we all make at least some IgG, especially to the foods that we're eating most often. And whether there's really any clear or convincing group of people that have a specific diagnosis that's associated with IgG has not been shown. Here?
I'm trying to connect what you just said to the patch test.
Yeah. So the patch test involves, it's a test looking for a delayed hypersensitivity response. So some people may have encountered this at the dermatologist's office where they're looking for evidence of a contact form of allergy to, usually due to small molecules, so chemicals, for example. That has definite diagnostic validity in many cases. Some of the same problems. I mean, the truth is all medical tests, right, suffer from some rate of false positives and false negatives. And that's why you always have to put it together with your sort of, your pre-test probability. You use the test, you understand its limitations, you understand how that moves you up or down the scale toward likelihood of diagnosis. So patch testing has also been used for a few forms of food allergy that I'm most familiar with. We, in fact, for 2 years did patch testing on a consecutive series of patients being seen for eosinophilic esophagitis. In my view, it did not prove to have any diagnostic validity in that context, so it didn't help us predict which foods were the culprits for causing the chronic inflammation in the GI tract. But that's the concept. It's also been looked at extensively in atopic dermatitis, and there are conflicting literature in that context. I would say overall, I think we're agnostic about it. I think it may be helpful for some people, but hasn't been shown in any sort of reproducible, randomized way to be effective. Back here?
You mentioned parasites at the very beginning
Yeah.
of your talk.
Oh, good.
And we've had a big change overall, we believe, in the in microbiome, but parasites hugely. I mean, yes, also microbiome hugely, but we talk more about bacterial microbiome, and we talk less about this big change that's happened in our parasitic microbiome. And there's interestingly some studies that are underway looking at the impact of reintroducing parasites to actually modulate the immune system. And they're pretty early on, but there's some studies in this area which I'm sure you're aware of. So what's been done to look in other parts of the world where parasitic diseases are still endemic?
Yeah.
To truly sort of ask the question of whether getting rid of parasites has been part of the change in our immune character and might be contributing to a change in our allergic disease process.
It's a great question. So I think everyone could probably hear you because you're in the back of the room, but it was just, what about parasites have changes in the burden, the infectious burden of parasites influenced rates of allergy? So this is awesome because I can introduce my wife, Annie, who's here in the front, who I enjoyed who does not have any parasites that I know of, but we enjoyed a lovely conversation together with an investigator named Falcone, Franco Falcone, who works in Rotterdam. He's Italian, and participated in a hookworm interventional trial. And he described this to us in great detail over dinner one time, I think when we were in Holland, actually. And I thought Annie might end our relationship at that night. But so So the trial data that I'm familiar with, and this is pushing the limit, so I probably should say I don't know. I don't know of any convincing data for food allergy at all. There was a trial that I almost participated in that involved exposure to a form of roundworm that can't productively infect humans. So it's Trichuris but it infects swine. It's been looked at in the context of Crohn's disease, and those trials failed ultimately. And so we abandoned the notion that we might look at it as for any efficacy in food allergy. I think it's an intriguing idea. I mean, there's no doubt that parasites have an immense impact on this arm of the immune response. And there is also evidence to say that if you want to make an effective regulatory immune response, it's best done in the same context as the pathological immune response that you're trying to suppress. In other words, regulatory T cells rely on some of the same homing cues that their pathogenic partners do. And so invoking regulatory responses in the context of allergic inflammation might be more effective than, say, the regulatory T cells that are generated because of exposure to bacteria. You can gauge by the amount of hand waving I do the thinness of the evidence base that underlies the answer, but there is a little bit, there's a researcher in Amsterdam that's done a little bit of epidemiological work that does support the concept that you're raising. But it's very difficult, I mean, what did Mark Twain say? Lies, damn lies and statistics or something like that, right? So epidemiology suffers that same fate, right? It can be, hopefully I haven't offended the 3 epidemiologists in the room terribly, but it's difficult to assign causality, and when you have, when you're looking for evidence of relationship to parasite burden, there's obviously lots of other factors, and so I think it's tricky, but there are data to support the notion. Yeah, I can see the author's name in my head. It starts with a Y, it has a Z in it, and it's like 7 syllables, so I can't pronounce it, but I can show you the paper afterward if you want. I saw some hands over here, yeah.
Both my grandson, age 10, and I have to carry an EpiPen. He, because he's tree nut, and sesame allergic since he's a little kid. And I, at age 60, became shellfish allergic. That bumpy, lumpy, larger than a cigar-shaped product. And although I can find a pocketbook to carry it in, my grandson's is usually in a backpack, which is not always near him.
Yeah.
And we were thrilled when the AviQ was introduced by those twin brothers, who also didn't know what to do in their pocket, and it looked like they were having an erection every time. So they did a lot of work and came up with this fabulous cell phone size AviQ, AUVI-Q. We loved it. It talked to us. It could fit into my grandson's pocket, his jeans, his anywhere, and I liked it too. And then it was taken off the market. What happened? Yeah.
Now, so for people that don't know the story about AviQ, and by the way, I'm going to remember the EpiPen. Yeah. Or are you just happy to see me, right? That's how the joke goes? So the story about AviQ is a really cool one. It's these brothers, one an engineer, the other, I forget his background, but basically they're twins, personally affected by food allergy, and they basically developed a much smarter epinephrine auto-injector. I actually, full disclosure, I consulted some with Sanofi, not with the twins, but once they licensed it to Sanofi for production, and it was basically the size, like bigger than a cell phone battery, but much smaller and more rationally shaped than the EpiPen. I don't get any money from Day, Mylan now, Day. And anyway, it got pulled, it was recalled, as you know, and they've been kind of cagey about exactly why, but there were concerns about the reliability and reproducibility of the drug delivery. It's thought to be a manufacturing problem. The latest I heard is that the brothers are in fact actively seeking another manufacturer, and so I do have hopes. So they re-released the license back to the brothers, and I think it's likely that it will see the light of day again. There's also a small Cambridge startup, if you're looking for an investment opportunity. I have no connection to them at all. But they have the really cool idea, I think. They're developing a device where the drug, the epinephrine, is lyophilized, it's powder form, and the device has an ampule of saline, and so on demand, it mixes the drug and delivers it. And the enormous advantage of that, which might not be immediately obvious to people, is the stability. So the big problem with the EpiPen, right, can't leave it in the car, can't get it cold, it's a real pain. This would be stable for years and at a very wide range of temperature. And so that's also, I think, a cool thing to watch in terms of helping to address an unmet need. Back?
If your child has an allergy, how do you know when he or she has overcome that allergy?
So you could all hear the question, I think, as the gentleman's in the back. Ultimately the answer is we do a food challenge. But one of the ways in which the IgE testing is useful is over time. And it is something of a marker over time to see a falling specific IgE level. It doesn't have to go to 0 before it may be time to do a food challenge. But what I'll do, I usually will, if it's a child who just to see me for food allergy, their other allergies are well managed, they don't really need me for much else, I'll simply see them once a year. And one of the things we're looking for is a drop in that specific IgE over time, which is an indicator that they may be ready for a food challenge. The history is also obviously important, so if they had an accidental ingestion of something they either did or did not tolerate, that obviously can be a little tip of the hand. It's not necessarily something to take to the bank because accidental exposures might be quite small and they could still be reactive. Also, things like oils really don't have any significant protein in them, so it's not a good judge of whether or not someone may have developed tolerance. But it's mostly falling in specific IgE and time from the last event that inform the decision of whether to do a food challenge. Yeah.
Why do allergies develop in adulthood if you've been free of them your whole life? And is there anything you can do to prevent it, or it's just going to happen?
Yeah, so why do allergies develop in adulthood? And you'll help me mind the time, Molly, is this? Okay. Well, that one I just have to say I don't know, mostly. There are changes in the balance of the immune system over time, immune senescence, which sounds all the more painful now because people say, your thymus is involuting by the time you're 30 or something, so I'm well over the hill in this regard. But that might, at least in some people, affect sort of the balance between Th2 and other arms of the immune response in a way that's kind of pro-allergenic. Pregnancy for some women actually promotes allergic responses. So there are things like that.
Is it common, or?
Well, again, I do so much pediatrics, but it's not uncommon. And even, for people that grew up in the same part of the country to develop. One of the interesting things that led to some insight into the whole immunotherapy concept was the observation of kids that grew up with pets who never had obvious problems with the pet, but then go off to college or leave the home otherwise and then are quite sensitive. Sometimes as soon as, by Christmas break, they come back and now suddenly, the cat is really bothering them. And so that is consistent with this concept that for some people, high-dose desensitization is a form of tolerance. So one more question? Someone that I haven't? I'll talk offline? All right, you got it.
In your studies, have you put any kind of synopsis on whether food allergies help create like Crohn's and colitis, or is it the other way around? That Crohn's and colitis, which are inflammatory bowel diseases, can help cause more food allergy? I have not come to any conclusions about the intersection between UC or Crohn's and food allergy, and I don't
study it very directly myself. I am really interested in that question. And again, the question marks in that overlap of circles. I think I mentioned before, there are occasionally subsets of people who have been given a diagnosis of Crohn's disease, have all the hallmarks, granuloma, the whole 9 yards, whose disease resolves, at least for a time, simply with the avoidance of antigens in the diet. So most extreme form would be like an elemental formula, it's just amino acids. So it would be an overreach to say, well, that proves that that person had Crohn's disease due to food allergies, but it's certainly suggestive. And I don't really see any strong, compelling reason why we shouldn't expect to find some people that have Th17-driven pathology due to food proteins. I think the only reason we've honed in on Th2 is because our patients presented to us. I'm no genius to tell the mother of a 2-year-old that their child has peanut allergy when they came in and told me that he took one bite and had hives and blew up and wheezed, right? I mean, they pay me to do that, believe it or not. I say, oh, you have a peanut allergy. So I think, it's kind of hitting us over the head, essentially, and led to us sort of understanding that there's this Th2-directed immune response to food proteins. But my hypothesis would be that we will find people when we begin looking systematically that have Th17, Th1, other sort of immune pathologies driven by food protein. But it need not stop there, right? Then autoantigens may become implicated as well, and it may take off into sort of more autocyclical cascade, as I think we see sometimes happens in patients with EoE or eczema. Some of them also have autoantigens that help drive the disease, et cetera. So I'm out of time. If you're interested in sort of this kind of very basic immune research, I hope you'll look us up and ask more questions. I think it's incredibly important and timely. I'm very excited about a collaboration we have together with the Broad and others to really push the envelope on this. So thanks for your attention.